Welcome back, fellow adventurers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we're joined by the incredibly talented Kat Richardson, whose work spans across urban fantasy, sci-fi, and beyond. Kat is celebrated for her Greywalker series and the acclaimed sci-fi novel Blood Orbit under the name K.R. Richardson. We're going to explore how her diverse background, including her experiences in music and game writing, has shaped her storytelling. So, Kat, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is really, exciting and fun for me.
It's more fun for me, I assure you. So, we're here to talk today about writing in genres, beyond genres, outside the genre box. Before we dive into the meaty topic of the day, though, I'd love to get your origin story. How did you fall in love with the written word, with games? How did you wander into the career? How did you get to where you are today?
Well, my dad was an English teacher, and his idea of cool bedtime stories was translated versions of the Odyssey, The Wind in the Willows, The Wind in the Door, and my father's Dragon, which is a very odd little book that came out in the 1940s. So, I kind of grew up on this background of kind of oddball literature that ranged from classics to modern kids' stories and then beyond. And my dad was never genre straitjacketed. He had a background in classics and English. And so he felt like everything was equal. He didn't feel that, genres were somehow dirty or not as good as literature. And, so we just kind of grew up with read what you want, They also read tons and tons. My father and my stepmother both read just massive amounts of mystery and crime fiction. So I picked that up. My sister was a big science fiction person, and so I kind of picked that up. And I had a college roommate who was a big romance reader, so I picked that up. And my minor was in history, so I was always, sticking my fingers into nonfiction stuff and historical stuff. And so then I went into journalism, and you constantly just soak up whatever's around and become instant expert for as long as it takes you to write an article and then dump it so you have room in the brain box for whatever comes next. So genre always seemed to me like it was kind of a silly thing to worry about. And then when I was, my first game was Pong on the horrible CRT at home. Mm-hmm. And, little by little, I stopped playing, and then I started getting interested again when things like Zork and Rogue, which I wasn't good at, but I tried. And then I put it aside for quite a long time. And one day I was sitting around at home, and I didn't really have a lot to do. And I had seen, what we at the time called computer games, because you had to have a computer to play them. And I saw something that really struck me as something I was interested in, which was Thief, the Dark Project. And so I got a copy, and oh my God, the heartbreaking price of $30. And started playing, had a problem with a particular mission, and my husband, the clever guy that he is, says, well, why don't you get online? There's like bulletin boards for this. And I stumbled into an early game forum. They were fairly new concept over at they called themselves TTLG, Through the Looking Glass, and they were great devotees of everything by Looking Glass Studios. And so I stuck my head in, asked my question. Someone answered the question. I said, cool. And then someone said something snide but funny, and we started just bantering back and forth. Before I knew it, I had become part of this community of gamers, and I realized here I was writing. By that time, I'd been in the journalism game for a while, and I was making a transition that was incomplete to fiction, hadn't yet been published. And they were so interested in story. And then they would talk about game mechanics as if they were totally separate things. And then I got sucked into working on T2X, which is Thief 2 extension. We wrote a little fan game, and I was the story lead. And suddenly I started seeing how story and game mechanics kind of, work together. And there was like this weird revelation of this is totally different and yet such an obvious extension of storytelling. So you have a new medium that you want to exploit what it can do for you differently and yet maintain that universal thing that humans have, this love for story. I mean, it's how we do everything when you come right down to it. That's how you learn things. That's how you enculturate. That's how you pass information. That's how you make speculations, how you speculate about the future. That's how you invent new stuff, is by telling yourself a story about something. And I mean, that's how we come up with myth systems and religion systems and even financial and economic systems, social systems. They all come from kind of telling yourself a story. Mm-hmm. And this kind of revelation about how story and system of some kind mesh, and how interesting games were at the time because they were changing so fast when you consider the technology. And I just kind of stuck with those guys for quite a long time. And then, you know, the group fell apart, but I continued being interested in story. And part of that was because one of the other members of the forum challenged me. He was writing a book and he said, "I bet I'm published before you are." And I said, "Oh, yeah?" Mm-hmm. So that got me to write my first published novel, which was Greywalker, right, which, you know, then went on to spawn a total of 9. And, you know, that's kind of how the whole thing started. So that intersection of story and game has kind of been the cornerstone of everything that I do now, even when I'm not, you know, consciously incorporating story and game in the same thing. You know, so that's just sort of how the whole thing started, regardless of how I ended up right here at this minute talking to you. Mm-hmm. Was that games and systems just sort of came together, and that's just how I do it now.
That's beautiful. Did your forum buddy, did they ever get their novel out there? Oh.
No. Pride goeth before a fall, apparently. Things went to hell for him. Part of me is happy and part of me is sad because he wasn't a bad guy. He was going through a period of being very arrogant about, you know, who he was and what he could do. And I assume that by now he's been taken down a peg by somebody because I didn't do it. I'm like, "Hey, look, I've got a book." And I didn't say anything about what was going on with him. It's just didn't seem important at the time.
Well, congratulations. So Greywalker was incredible. And you also done Blood Orbit, the sci-fi book. Game writing, what did you do in that space?
Well, aside from, you know, doing the stuff for T2X, yeah. I've done a little, I did a race manual for a tiny little company. I think they're still in business, but now I've forgotten their name. It was not a fun experience because it was, you know, we were all kind of inexperienced and I wasn't much of a tabletop player. I mean, I had played a little at the time, but I didn't do it very often. And so I wasn't very experienced with that kind of system. And I got into a bit of a wrangle with one of the other editors because I was writing, he was editing my piece, and we got into a massive shrieking argument about the story segments that I was writing along with the race development. It was called Moon Elves, but for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the system. It wasn't fun, and it took me 2 years to get paid and a lot of arguing and sending, you know, veiled letters and then slightly less veiled letters. But, you know, that's kind of how things happen with very small startups, especially people who are in something that they love because they're enthusiasts, but don't really have any business acumen. And that can be very frustrating for me because I have a degree in magazine editing, mm-hmm. and I worked for a while in the industry, and then I moved into technical editing. And so I've got a really good idea of the process of creating any kind of published, finished work and all of the background stuff and the scheduling and, you know, the legalese and so on that goes into that. And so working with people who were enthusiasts but didn't have any business background was occasionally frustrating. Like I said, as far as I know, the company's still around. But life of me, I can't remember the name of them, and it's so embarrassing. Everybody there was very good-hearted. They just were not business people. And it was frustrating to me to have to argue with them for 2 years to get paid the pittance that I got paid for, the whole great big race manual. These things happen.
Yeah.
Do
you still play tabletop games?
I don't really have much of an opportunity because I used to live on a boat, and then now I live someplace isolated from a lot of the other people I know. And so playing tabletop always seems to work better when you're actually in the same room. I mean, I know people who do it online.
Yes.
But I've somehow fallen out of the habit. And there's a lot of games I'd love to play. I have a particular fascination with Blades in the Dark, and I've never been able to find someone else who wants to play. And I'm like, oh, come on, this looks like fun.
Yeah, it's a good game.
Yeah. I've seen other people play it. I've played a little bit just to get a feel for it. I think the system is really clever in that it's designed to get you into actually playing as fast as possible instead of worrying about stats and mechanics, which can be a really slow way of entering. If you're a very systems-bound person, then that's great. But if you're kind of more on the story side, then getting in there and having that adventure really fast. And I think Blades in the Dark really does the whole dark system does a great job of giving you that opportunity to just get in there and start, having the adventure as fast as possible.
Yeah, it's a fantastic system. And I love the fail-forward mechanics. Something goes wrong, it still moves the story forward, as opposed to you can't pick that door, you have to find another way. The story stops here. It's brilliant.
Yeah,
so much fun.
I had thought about trying to adapt the system to do a Greywalker supplement for the dark system, and I just haven't gotten around to digging into it hard enough and long enough to figure out exactly how to come up with the analogs that for character archetypes and how to break it down for their system in a way that would make it friendly. But I think it would be a great system for the way Greywalker reads. How the world is built there. And I'm like, wow, I'd really love to do that. So if anybody out there wants to help me,
I might know a guy.
We know a guy who knows a guy.
Yeah. That guy might be me. Let's dig into the topic of the day, though. But I say this every single time, but now I want to bring you back and talk with you about game mechanics and how they relate with stories. But today we're talking genre. Because the reason I want to talk about genre with you is because you made such a strong name with Greywalker, and then you come out with Blood Orbit, and you released Blood Orbit under a pseudonym-ish, kind of.
Yeah.
And there was obviously a reason for that. So kind of walk me through, let's set the stage here. Genre, how did you fall in love with the first genre? Why did you pick that genre? Why did you move yourself into a different genre? Kind of just start to set the stage, give me a feeling for your idea on genre, this big capital word with quotation marks around it.
As far as I'm concerned, most of what we normally think of as genre is a marketing tool. They're handy labels for consumers so that they can winnow down the mass. I mean, when you look at how much is published every year, just in English in North America, it's tens of thousands of volumes every year in just the fiction genres. Not looking at nonfiction or all the rest of that. Hell, it's tens of thousands just in the romance genre. But and they're their own special thing. So a lot of it is about marketing. But when you have some idea of what tropes or settings or conventions, plot types, etc., you're utilizing, makes it so much easier to find the audience. So if you know what genre it is, you're already halfway to connecting to an audience because you say, hey, it's a mystery. And you go, okay, all of the people who like mysteries, which are a very structural kind of genre, come along and go, ooh, a mystery. So that's, my professional view on genre. But I also think that it can be frighteningly straitjacketed. When I wrote Greywalker, at that time, the term urban fantasy was only just starting to be used. And my initial pitch was not, this is an urban fantasy. My initial pitch was, this is a cross-genre mystery with fantasy elements and horror elements. And I was later, told, oh no, it's urban fantasy, and we don't understand what this term cross-genre means. And I was literally told, nobody knows what this means. And now it's a very common term in publishing. Oh, it's cross-genre. Because we've started to recognize that story and readership have this flexibility. And it's something that game actually beat us to. Gamers have been playing in these cross-genre spaces for a long time. RPGs, whether they're fantasy, science fiction, modern realism, etc., have always had that intersection of multiple genre. It's just kind of automatic. And then, there's always been elements of other genres within bigger genres. But what really got me going with Greywalker was I really wanted to write a detective novel that had ghosts in it. And this is considered a big no-no, or it was until recently, in the mystery genre. We don't write what they call the woo-woo stuff. So paranormal elements were considered a bad thing in traditional mystery. Although, when you go back to the beginnings of mystery, and even into like the 1950s, people like Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who wrote Gothic mysteries, and she included creepy stuff, ghosts, or the intimation of ghosts. There were a couple of interesting books that involved psychics. Cornell Woolrich famously wrote The Night Has a Thousand Eyes, which is about a fake psychic who starts having real psychic episodes. There was a great film in the late 30s starring Edward G. Robinson that adapted that short story, same title. And it's much creepier on film than it is in a book, but it's definitely a crime story. And yet it has this element of, the psychic and the strange. And all of these genres that I tend to deal with come out of the old pulp tradition, where, everything and the kitchen sink was thrown into a monthly or weekly magazine, and they subspecialized, but they would still, cross things up a little bit. And, Weird Tales, the original Weird Tales, had a lot of strange stuff in it, as well as detective fiction. And then they would have, ghost stories and really creepy stuff. And no one thought it was strange then. So I had worked with the urban fantasy thing for a while, and I got to a good stopping point with Greywalker. And this story had been bugging me since book 2, because when I started doing research on the second Greywalker story, Poltergeist, I ran across a real-life crime that I found absolutely fascinating, because it was a social commentary when you came right down to it. The crime occurred in an ethnic neighborhood, but all the cops involved were white. And it took them quite a bit longer than it should have to figure out what had actually happened, because they had no concept of the culture in which they were treading to try and solve this crime, even though if they'd had 5 minutes and one Chinese guy, they would have figured it out, within days. Instead, it took them months to kind of go, wait a minute, this was an inside job, instead of thinking that it was, outsiders who had come in and done this horrible thing. And I thought, this is a really interesting example of how cultures don't talk well. And it was an interesting social commentary, especially as we were heading into, because I wrote the first draft of it long before the first Trump campaign. And as, we were getting into that, I was finishing up this novel and trying to sell it. And so many things about othering other people because they're not like you, and not being able to solve a problem because you can't get out of your own cultural head long enough to see someone else's view became things I really, really wanted to write about. And so the book got a little bit of a retool and became very much a social commentary book, but it was still a crime novel and set in a science fictional world because I just couldn't say these things about the real world without having someone take my head off. So I put it in a fictional world that I could manipulate, where I could make certain elements literally, well, not actually black and white, but red, blue, and yellow, because this way I could simplify things and point fingers without getting in trouble. And along the way, I thought, well, let's see if this book can stand on its own. Let's see if this book is strong enough to make it without having the Kat Richardson name stuck on it. And also, primarily male leads in science fiction, I felt it might be better to give it a slightly different brand and see how it worked, and not have people shy away from the books because, oh no, it's urban fantasy, which is one step from romance. I've literally had people come up to me at conferences and say, well, I haven't read your books because I don't read romance. And I'm like, really? Because I don't write it.
Yeah.
I do, but it's one of those strange things where, alas, the poor genre just gets such a slam. But, if you can't write good relationships, if you can't write believable human relationships, you really need to work on that if you're going to be a successful fiction writer. And romance is all about writing, compelling and interesting human relationships. So whether you're a big fan of the way it's done or not, it's still a very useful genre to have some familiarity with. So I thought, well, let's try to avoid that whole, here's a woman writing about men predominantly. And there is actually a small romance element to it, but it's not a romance novel, and it's not a typical science fiction novel, and it's not quite a typical police procedural. So let's just give it another brand and we'll see how it goes. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, it did well critically and poorly market-wise. So, oh well.
That happens.
It does. I still get, fan mail saying, when are you going to write another one? I'm like, I don't know. I'd really like to, but I've got to figure out a way to resolve some issues with the publisher.
Gotcha. You sometimes you'll hear people, writers and teachers and people in the space talk about how genre is used because it's shorthand, so that a reader picks up a book, they already know they can make assumptions and you can more quickly move in. What are your thoughts on that? The whole idea that by using the word elf, you already have an idea of what this thing looks like. And
I think it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it does give people an easy handle. On the other hand, you end up creating these little pigeonholes that people end up in, and then you get that, well, I don't read romance kind of thing. I mean, people have told me they don't read science fiction too. And I'm like, wow, you're really missing some great stuff. Also, have you ever read, any of these science fact things? Because effectively all science fact started as science fiction. Somebody was speculating like crazy. So, yeah, I run hot and cold on the whole genre idea or archetypes as well. It's like, well, here is this archetype. Well, that's nice. What are you doing with it? Yeah. What are you doing that makes it something other than a bunch of little paper cutouts that you move around on a static background, which is the worst kind of fiction. And no matter what the genre is, things where you have, stock characters being moved across a stock background it can be comforting because it's familiar and non-challenging, but in the end, you reach a level of sophistication just naturally where you're bored with it. And that's the downside to allowing that genre straitjacket to get you, is you can get to the point of being bored because you see no other thing to do with it.
Gotcha. You mentioned research, and it piqued something in my brain. And I think you kind of answered this, but I'm curious. When you have an idea, when you come across something that's like an interesting murder mystery or an interesting crime, and you're like, I need to tell this story, or I need to pick a place to put that. How do you pick where to begin? Because obviously you're innovative enough that you have no problem blending genres and jumping across the fence here and there where it's necessary. But how would you go, okay, this is obviously primarily a fantasy story or primarily a science fiction story. How do I take this crime and put it in a tavern in a medieval town, or put it in on a different planet 500 years in the future? How do you make that choice?
Some of it's just what ifing. I kind of spitball around with things. What if X? I'm kind of working on a sequel right now to a book that's coming out. My first book in 6 years will be coming out in November. And the other night I was saying, I've got to get to a point where these two characters come to some kind of detente. They've had a big falling out. And like, oh, what if, they're forced into this situation? I'm like, now I just have to figure out how to get there. So a lot of times it's like, wouldn't this be interesting? Or I really need a particular thing to happen. Or I really want a particular effect, or I really want to see a particular structural motion happen in the plot, or have a particular place in a character arc that I really want this particular thing to happen, and I want to create this effect. And what is in my twisted little imagination, the logical connection there? The whole Greywalker of it originally came about because I used to watch an old British series called Randall and Hopkirk Deceased, the original, which came out in the early 70s. And it's about, two London-based detectives, and one of them dies and comes back as a ghost and drives his partner crazy. And they, continue to solve crimes partially through the auspices of being able to talk to the dead or to walk through walls and look at stuff and things like that. And I thought, okay, I can do that. I mean, it's still a crime story. And, I think I've gotten off your original question there, but yeah, it's largely a matter of, how do I get to this particular thing? And then I arrange my little beads of interesting scenes and interesting effects together and start looking for ways to connect them. So, and just not thinking in terms of what's the genre convention, but how do I get here in a way that's satisfying to me? How do I get there in a way that includes this thing that I really want my readers to see and experience with me? So how do I make the story route go through that without it feeling jarring? And I always think of plotting kind of like a road trip. I want to go from, New York to California, and I can either go straight down, I-90 the whole way, or I can, wander around all over the place and go and see all the interesting tourist attractions along the way. But why am I going there? So that's kind of how I put stories together, and that is how the genres end up getting, put together in my head. Also in my mind, long before anybody had discussed it with me professionally, I had come up with this revelation that genre, as we think of it, falls into two major subcategories. Genre that relies on certain tropes, and genre that relies on certain settings. So there are setting-based genres, and then there are trope-based genres. And when you can take a setting kind of genre like science fiction, it also has tropes, but mostly we think of science fiction as having either a specific scientific process going on, or that it's in a certain kind of setting. It's in a setting, it's in space, or it's in a lab, or it's in the future. And then we say, well, you can take something that's got a lot of tropes, structures, or archetypes and put it into that same setting. And is it still science fiction? Probably, but it could also be a forensic thriller. In fact, a lot of early forensic thrillers are effectively science fiction, because at that time, forensic pathology was a new science. And so early forensic thrillers are actually a form of science fiction, even though the writer and Kathy Reichs would kill me for saying that, but some of the early ones, I mean, if you've ever seen an early episode of CSI, I mean, talk about science fiction.
It's true.
So that's kind of how I do it, is I just, I take these two genre concepts, these kind of genre types, and then I start sticking the pieces together, is to see what kind of strange thing happens or what I can do with that the normal inventions of that genre would not allow me to do. Like, how can I do something else within this genre, even if I have to borrow from somebody else?
Very cool. It has
I rabbit on.
It has a free flowing feel to it that it's like, I really like that idea of one type of genre being almost like an adjective and the other one be like you can add them together to create a compound, like space romance or science fiction, pandemic, murder mystery. Anyways, but the organic feel of it kind of reminds me of what you said about how games have influenced the way you structure. Is that part of the process? Like, what did you learn from the game writing that you now apply to that process you just described?
Well, game writing is a strange beast, because when very early on when we were working on T2X, one of the things that we had to think about was the engine. And I'm sure that this is true for all game writers, is what can the engine do? What can the engine not do? What are our special tricks that we definitely want to utilize? Because, this engine is good at that. So how can we utilize the engine in a way that is optimal for our storytelling? And how can we optimize our storytelling to make the engine really shine so the whole thing comes together? Although quite frequently, and this is a discussion I see from game devs and game journalists a lot, is the kind of weird disconnect between the way you are forced to play a game because game and the story. So like stories where you're supposed to be, this very compassionate person who is, trying to do something good for other people, and yet the convention of that particular game world requires you to kill things right, left, and sideways. It's like, these two things don't go together. And yet we all play games where the mechanics are to a certain degree at odds with the story, which is where, things that really break those kind of conventions, like Undertale, become really interesting. Here's a story where the mechanics of the game engine itself are intrinsic to the way the story plays out. Even on replay, I'm not spoil it for anyone who has never played Undertale, but tread carefully your first time through.
It's been out for a while. I'm sure it's safe, but yes, I know what you mean.
But I mean, really, that's brilliant. It's murderous, but it's brilliant, But that was bespoke. They built that engine in that game to do exactly that. Whereas most of the time now you have, maybe you're working with Unreal, and I just saw a video for Unreal 5 engine this morning, and I'm like, oh,
it's crazy.
Yeah, or you're using Unity or something, and it's really good at certain things and kind of janky with other things, and so you're looking for ways to, avoid the jank.
Avoid the jank. I like that.
But still tell this interesting and compelling story that isn't necessarily a just kill everything in sight. I mean, some of our earliest games on Unreal, of course, were, very basic shooters.
Yep.
There was no story in a lot of them, except, this, basic little capsule of you are a space marine or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. There's no story there. The players then kind of developed story out of it. There's all this genre, all this fan fiction, evolved out of a story that has a game that has no story. But we want it so much that, the players kind of make it happen. so working with a game that we knew was going to run on the still extant Dark Engine, we were thinking, what can you do with a Dark Engine that helps our story? And what would we like to do that Dark Engine wasn't originally designed to do, but which we can make it do? And so we had, weird jumping puzzles, which unfortunately Dark Engine didn't actually do jumping well. It made you do it a lot, but you were constantly falling off of things, and the whole mantling system was a little less than perfect. And but it had these wonderful lighting effects where you could, kind of disappear in the shadows and so on. I mean, come on, the game was called Thief, for God's sake. And so we were trying to take advantage of what the game did offer us and write a story that pulled in as many interesting elements of what the engine could do as possible. And then things went in a very Terry Pratchett kind of direction. It all got very goofy and strange, and I spent a lot of time trying to haul my co-writers in, going, come on, there's such a thing as homage, and then there's plagiarism. Back off. Yeah, before we get an injunction. So that was actually the biggest problem was when you're working with somebody else's stuff and they very graciously are turning a blind eye to the fact that we're all out there playing with their stuff. And they're like, yeah, we don't see you guys doing things that potentially could be, a problem. As long as you don't tell us, we don't know. The odd thing is we were all friends with the developers, and they would stick their heads in every once in a while and go, how's it going? Fine. And then, Looking Glass Studios went under, so it kind of didn't matter at that point in time. But yeah, I was, thinking about the mechanics, and I think that really good games have story that works very well with their engine. And it's great when you've got a bespoke engine, but a lot of people just can't afford that kind of development. Engines are expensive to develop.
Yeah.
And so, you try and figure out a way to utilize what you've got in a way that propels your story. And then there's always that little thing where you're like, I'm not going to look at the fact that my story and my mechanics are doing this in a couple of places, because we have to keep people engaged. People are engaged by action and puzzle solving and progressing forward. If we put them in loops where they can't do one of those three because our engine prefers to do things one way and our story wants to do it another way, we're never going to finish. Right. So sometimes you just go, I guess we're just going to have a big fight scene here. Because fight scene.
It's those constraints that make you get creative, though, right?
Yeah. Like we were talking about, the Blaze in the Dark and how it's very flexible. But if you're not thinking in terms of that kind of, kind of roll back mechanic, the game's going to kind of throw you for a loop for a while. Like, I don't need to, I don't have to say everything that's in my pack and then deal with the fact that I didn't pack the one thing I needed. Like, yep.
Yeah. Completely different game experience and different kind of stories that come out of it. I'm going to take us on a side tangent for a second, because in my notes, you have a music theater background.
Yeah.
How did that... Go ahead. I need to know.
That was another dadism, because he put himself through college working as a singing waiter. He had a beautiful singing voice. And so, we grew up in musical theater. And so that's kind of another one of those magic things that's like in the background, is that whole idea that any minute now someone could stop and break into song is kind of in the back of my head all the time. I'm actually kind of sad that people feel constrained, especially in the U.S., against singing or dancing, because, they're such joyous things. And I feel like we have decided that there's a special class of people who are allowed to sing and dance in public and the rest of us are not. That's too bad. But that was my first exposure to to these compact short forms of story through a particular mechanical delivery, because musical comedy theater has a really predictable structure. And, it's like we're going to introduce everything with a song that's sort of generalized, tell us about the setting and the story, and then we're going to have some people talking, and then we'll have another song. We have a character song, and then we have a situational song, and then we have a transitional progression song. And it's actually really mechanical, but you don't see it because, people are singing and dancing and wearing interesting costumes and doing strange things. And so it's kind of, in that world from the time I was about 7 or 8. So it didn't seem strange to me to have this idea of a structure that tells a story through this kind of fluffy set dressing on top of it. And a lot of set dressing. I spent a lot of time, making costumes and building sets and things like that. I was a backstage person most of my youth. I was never on stage, but I did sing in choir. And so I started out, singing in church choir, and then, school choirs and all that good stuff. And I think I was only actually on stage 3 times in my entire life in a production, all over for 26 weeks. Let me tell you, you never want to sing Food Glorious Food again once you've done it for 26 straight weeks.
That's a long run. That's a long run.
And it was an amateur theater too, so that's unusual. They're usually, like 6 weeks.
Yeah, at the most.
Yeah. It was just one of those very unusual things. The theater happened to hit the right thing at the right time, and they ended up being invited to a whole bunch of festivals. And so we just stayed, and it was the same cast for 26 weeks. We didn't even roll anybody out. It was amazing. So 26 weeks of Food, Glorious Food. We had, because it was a small company, all the kids did double duty as both orphans and Fagin's gang. So you had to scramble backstage after the orphanage scenes and get into your pickpocket clothes.
That is so cool. We're a big musical theater house too. Our kids all do musical theater, so we break out in song all the time. That's how we live. Yeah, all the time.
Yay! I wish people felt a lot more comfortable with it, because even if you're not a great singer, my stepmother was just horrendously tone deaf. As she used to say, I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but I'll try anyhow. We didn't care. She obviously got so much enjoyment out of singing, even though it was absolutely ear-killing. But she was enjoying herself. And after you got over the initial, oh my God, really, Mom? It was great, and I'm really sad that doesn't happen, just on the street. We don't live in La La Land, alas. People don't start singing and dancing. It's a terrible film, but at least it had an interesting premise.
Okay.
But yeah, that's where I started, was in musical theater.
I was wondering how that impacted your storytelling, but you covered that, so that's fantastic. That's so cool.
There you go. Well, a lot of time backstage looking at the mechanics of how a show happens.
Yeah.
They're literally throwing, these old style light switches, and things like that.
Yeah, they make that nasty sound when you close them.
Oh no, we didn't have switches, but we did have, I can't even remember exactly what they are, but they had this lock, and you twist the lock down, stop at the lock point, so you could preset how bright a light was. And then as soon as you were done with that scene, you'd have to, go and change all of them, because you were going to have to set up for the next scene. And at one point, we had 3 people in a closet, like the size of a standard coat closet, and running all the backstage stuff for, I can't even remember what show it was, but thankfully we're all skinny women. So here's all these 3 girls, these giant switches, and and then we're trying not to elbow each other while we're changing the switch. It was pretty hilarious. It's a good thing there's no extant film of that, because it was like we were doing something illegal in 6 states in there.
All this grunting and yeah, okay. All right.
Things
Well,
happen.
that's a heck of a story.
Yeah, my whole life is a heck of a story, really.
Right on. It's a good way to be. Well, I think we're going to start. What's that?
It's not boring.
That's true. There you go. I think we'll start wrapping her up here, but I do want to bring a close to the whole genre conversation. And I guess the best way for me to do that would be if you were to pick one, if you could only write primarily in a genre, which one would you pick and why?
That's a tough one. And most of my stuff has been mystery structured, and I have a really strong affinity for that structure. But I really love certain things about fantasy in a way that's hard to discard. And to a certain degree, it's a cheat because fantasy is the broadest genre definition ever. Technically, anything you can imagine is fantasy. So in a way, all fiction is fantasy, but avoiding playing technical games, I think fantasy is where and it's still broad anyhow, is probably where I would go because I always feel like as wonderful as science is, and I love science, it's the magic, whether it's a sort of mundane magic or small magic or a huge, glorious wizard standing on, mountaintops, bringing the stars down from above or whatever. I think that there's something about a magical world that is compelling and freeing and in some ways ultimately terrifying, which is so cool to have something that has this breadth and width and all this depth and flexibility. And yet it still has some rules, but it almost encourages you to break them. By its very nature, it says, go out and break rules. And I think that's sort of where I am destined to be all the time, is seeing how I can creatively break a rule and get away with it.
I love it. That's good. Okay, well, we're going to start heading for the door. I have a question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, regardless of what you do for a living or which field you're from or what. And that question is, in my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but also improv, comic book writing, tabletop role-playing games, where we can all just hang out. There's a shared language, there's a fellowship. If you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you do, what do you think is the magical thread that holds all of that together?
Magical thread that holds that together. Honestly, I feel like our drive as human beings is to tell story and to acquire story as a way of both expanding and experiencing and passing on. Oh, that was 3. Humanity. That's how we are human, is through telling and experiencing, sharing and changing story, no matter how we apply mechanism to do that. And I feel that is the thread, because it is without doubt the most human and humanizing thing about our experience on this earth.
That's a great answer. It's a great answer.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're going to start heading for the door. I do like to open up a little space. Is there anything you're working on or have worked on that you want to promote? There might be perhaps a book coming up you'd like to mention.
Yeah, I have finally, after 6 years, I've got a new novel coming out in November called Storm Waters, and it's another, Kat Richardson special. It's a 1930s crime novel set in the golden age of Hollywood, and it features a rich young asshole Am I allowed to say that?
Oh, yes.
Who has a magical power with water, and he is haunted by the ghosts of all the people that his family has killed over centuries in order to acquire this power. And he finds himself framed for the murder of his mistress, and he has to solve that problem. And going down the road of solving that problem gets him involved with a bunch of family destiny that he then has to either fight or accept. And it was inspired by all those great hard-boiled crime novels of the 1920s and early 30s. And it's written in a very Hammett-esque kind of style. And it's coming out from Fairwood Press in November. I'm really excited about it because it's like the marriage of my two favorite things ever. Weird magic and crime fiction from the 1920s.
I'm there. That sounds great.
I can't.
Yeah.
Yes, Stormwaters, Fairwood Press.
Okay. There'll be links in below. Other than that, it's time to head out the door. I want to give you the final word, though. Do you have any parting words of wisdom before I push you out into the cold?
Oh, gosh. Go play with your stories. Just play with them. Go get them right now.
You're not going to believe this, but a portal to a dark realm just opened up, so I'm going to have to close the tavern to keep our stories safe. But before we go, thank you again to Kat for sitting down and sharing your insight and wisdom. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring those worlds. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.